Alright, YouTube, so I know it's been a little while since I made any content. Frankly, a lot of things were going rather smoothly in the cultural space. I didn't really feel like um, there were any real landmark discoveries or insights or conversations happening. I really felt like it was more of the same, and things were generally trending in about as good as a direction as one could hope for in the chaotic mess that is 2024. Now, the last video I made was a month or two ago, and it was about Jordan Peterson's um, sort of trying to understand the concept of God or gods or religious language through LLMs, through large language models, basically AI text prediction programs that are so powerful and trained and fed on so much data that they can simulate human conversation through word associations. And so Jordan Peterson's idea was basically that you could have um, a statistical relationship in vector space between various different words and types of words, word categories, and you could sort of figure out which words were closest to concepts that are sort of hard for people to understand. So, people normally don't have an issue conceptualizing something like a table or a chair or a desk because they're relatively self-evident and they're close to us in their sort of ontology in 3D space. Now, a concept um, like a god or a even a country or a society or something abstract like property rights or human rights or sovereignty can be much more difficult for people to understand, and some people will go ahead and say, oh, that's not real. And of course, then the famous question is, what do you mean by real, etc., etc. And that gets down a whole rabbit hole. So I think one of the things that Jordan and people in that space, that intellectual space, of which there are several, have been trying to do is to clarify and develop a framework for talking about things which aren't necessarily self-evident to our perceptual sort of ontology that we're familiar with. So I wanted to um, check this video out here because to me this is one of the first peer reviews, quote unquote, of that process. And I think that good dialogue is absolutely necessary and criticism is absolutely necessary to refine these sort of complex, important processes because, you know, as great of a mind as Jordan is able to integrate all these different concepts together, everybody has their blind spots, and people who have maybe a more analytical mindset or sometimes a more romantic or artistic mindset can come in and either add or poke holes in your beliefs or arguments. And I think ultimately that's good because it's stress testing, and genuinely we believe that stress testing in idea space leads to a more robust set of axioms and deductions. So, because Jordan is no longer in the academy, a lot of and the academies are generally broken and not very useful right now. Nobody's really been able to criticize his work, so I was hoping that in his more scholarly papers, his less popular papers, there would be people who rose up to criticize him, and this guy seems to be one of the best ones at the moment. So I wanted to do a little bit of commentary on this and just sort of give my thoughts on it and sort of introduce it to as many people as I can. So without further ado, let's get into it.
What can we learn about our concept of God through the study of large language models? Well, that's a topic that I was alerted to today on Jordan Peterson's Twitter, where he referred to this research. I wanted to go over it with you and see what you think and what I think and whether it makes good sense or not. So this is from collectivelabs.ai, semantic core clarification. And here's what they write. Many concepts that we use are inherently ambiguous. Terms like God, truth, and goodness are complex and variable concepts that lack a tangible referent, compared to concrete terms like tables and chairs. While semantic core clarification reduces the ambiguity of concepts by finding the tangible concepts that cumulatively approximate their meaning. So in other words, we're going to take a concept that in and of itself does not have a tangible referent, and it's going to, quote, find the tangible concepts that cumulatively approximate that meaning. So here in the image, you see that prince is linked to heir, boy, and king, and they say something about that in what follows. The last hidden layer of large language models represents the relative meaning of words to that model in a semantic space. Words that are close to each other in that space, like truck and car, have a similar meaning. Words that are far apart, like truck and sandwich, have a dissimilar meaning. What about related words, like, for example, truck and bumper? I guess that would be close. Truck and wheel, truck and guns. It gives you a sense. Things that belong together are roughly coded together. They're physically located together in that space. When the coordinates of specific words in this space are added together, the resulting vector represents the composite meaning of those words. The composite meaning can be inferred from the vectors that are nearest to the composite. For example, when the coordinates of boy, king, and heir are combined, the resulting vector is close to the coordinates for prince. Now I wonder, are they landing on something else besides prince, and prince just happens to be nearby, and it's the only plausible candidate for the combination of boy, king, and heir? So what does it mean to say that it's very close to the coordinates for prince? Why is it not exactly the coordinates for prince? Is that because prince maybe also needs like princess and castle and sword or something else? But okay, fine. Boy, king, and heir get us close to the coordinates for prince if we do this vector addition or composition. This aligns with our intuitive understanding of the concept of prince. A prince is a boy who is heir to be king. SSC, which again is this semantic core clarification, searches through the semantic space of LLMs to find which terms, when combined, most closely approximate the position of target words in that space.
All right, so just a couple things that I want to elucidate here, and then I'll get back to the video. So one of the things that he correctly pointed out is that when you're dealing with vectors in a multidimensional space, one of the things that you have to deal with is like approximations versus precision. So it's an issue of precision. So if, like he said, prince is the combination of boy, king, and heir or something like that, you have to look at the whole picture. So what else is around? Is there something arbitrary around or that seems arbitrary? So basically for any, any combination of, or anything where there's a gradient of space where you're looking for extra precision, you basically have to sort of define your metric for interpretation. So like, how are you interpreting the analysis of this space, right? Like, you have to show your work. And that's going to be a theme that I think we're going to come back to a lot here, is that a lot of this stuff seems like they're filling in the gaps with a kind of intuition. And if you want to clarify this stuff, you can't fill in the gaps with a sort of intuition, or you have to use as little of that as possible. You have to be very precise and mathematical in your understanding if you want to make this more than just opinion. The other thing to hear, and this is kind of a postmodern point, is so what is the data set that you're training this stuff on? Because cultural context really does matter in this situation. So for instance, boy or prince would probably have very different associations if you're talking about, let's say around the time of the American and French revolutions. Depending on who you're talking to, a concept like monarchy or sovereignty would probably have very different word associations depending on who you're asking. So for instance, if you ask some American revolutionary during the 1700s, like late 1700s, what do you think about prince? Like, what words do you think are most closely associated with prince or king or something? He'd probably have a lot more polemic things to say about that than somebody in Britain or maybe even Spain or something like that. So I think cultural context is important. So it's very important, I think, for the people doing this kind of research to articulate and mathematize the steps that they took so that people can criticize those.
Application. To clarify the concept of God, the hidden layer of two LLMs was probed, DESI LM7B and Llama 3.8B. Both of these models are top performers in their respective classes as of April 2024. All 3 word combinations of 1,000 common abstract nouns were computed, and their respective positions were calculated relative to the position of the God vector in each semantic space. So a few things we could ask, why was it 3 word combinations, not 2, 4, 5? Why was it 1,000 common abstract nouns and not 10,000? How would the answers differ if we varied those things?
One way that you could tell if you're converging on something more real is if you add more variables or more words and you get closer to this God vector that he's talking about, or any other vector that you're trying to approximate relation to. So I would be curious to see if you add more variables, do you get farther away from where you're quote-unquote trying to go, or do you get closer to it? And what if you add various different kinds of nouns? Also, when you're talking about this DESI LM7B and Llama 3.8B, I would want to know, what does it mean for them to be a top performer? Like, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean they're not printing out gibberish? Or does it mean that, like, they're giving certain answers? And, like, we basically have to be careful not to do the Google Gemini thing with this, where we program our biases into the LLMs. So, and also, I would wonder if, well, we'll get to that later.
But let's go with this. 3 word combinations, 1,000 common abstract nouns. And now we get the results that in the Llama 3 semantic space, the combination of fortune, awe, and law produced the vector that was closest to the God vector, even better than the combination of Lord, Yahweh, and Elohim. Fortune, awe, and law. And when I saw this, I'm just going to pause and tell you that what jumped out, well, okay, wait, I'll tell you in a minute. In the DESI LM semantic space, the combination of spirit, law, and greed produced the vector that was closest to the God vector, again, doing better than Lord, Yahweh, and Elohim.
So there's a couple things here. One of them is, why are they using Jewish words for the concept of God when, it's like, are you trying to specifically talk about God referenced in the Old Testament? Like, why are you using those as references, like Lord, Yahweh, and Elohim? Also, the concept of Lord has many different, so are you talking about, like, the Lord of, like, I don't know, like Nottingham in, like, the 1700s or something? Or are you talking about, like, this transcendent Lord hypothesized by the Jewish people in the desert in, 2000 BC or something? Like, so there's already some problems here, and I would want to know why they chose those words. Also, like he said, why 3? Why not 2? Why not 5? Why not 500? I would be curious to know, why they chose those words specifically. I was joking in the comments of this video, actually, that they should be called Semitic core clarification, not semantic core clarification, because it's very clear that this program has a pretty strong cultural bias. Regardless, all that aside, which is a pretty glaring error, so now they've produced 2 of these these 3 word combinations that are closer to the God vector. One is fortune, awe, and law, and one is spirit, law, and greed. So I'm curious as to how they're going to rank order those, like why, like how are they going to deal with that greed variable that got thrown in there? How are they going to interpret that? Are they going to disregard it because it doesn't fit their preconceived model, or are they going to just say, okay, well, greed is closer to God than the word Yahweh? Like, that's very curious, so we'll see what happens.
So first thing you notice here is that law is common to both of these, which I think shows you just how integral to the notion of God is the notion of law, or vice versa, just how integral to the notion of law is the notion of God. You know what I mean?
So, just as an aside, one of the things that I did say in, I believe, the video commenting on the Bishop Barron speech and the video commenting on, what is it, Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke that I made a few, like last year or earlier this year, can't quite remember when I made it, is that what people in the West are calling God is a composite being of basically the forces of harsh law and the forces of sort of cultural goodwill. And it's actually two things playing together. And that was basically my hypothesis that got basically composed via some sort of game theory into, because one thing is easier to remember than two things, which is easier to remember than 50 things, etc. So, which is why things tend to trend toward, people's beliefs tend to democratically trend toward things that are easier to remember over time. So it's nice to see that concept being fleshed out and clarified by LLMs, because the way that I came to that conclusion was through a very similar sort of manual LLM process of statistical covariation with different words and different patterns of behavior. So we'll see how this continues.
Law and God are very closely related. Then, okay, spirit, you can see that sort of the spirit of God, God as spirit, God in the spiritual world, God as the topic of spirituality. Okay, fortune up here on Llama 3, you can understand that as well, because God is kind of like, take Xenophon on Socrates. He says Socrates used to say that if you have something that belongs to a technical skill, you don't really need to pray, you just need to apply the technical skill. But when there's something that falls outside of the technical skill and is a matter of fortune or chance, something over which you don't have control, then it's appropriate to pray to the gods for help in that area. So for example, you know that you can heal a man with your skill, but you don't know whether it's going to be the good fortune of this man to go on and live a good life or a bad life, whether you're doing him good or evil by healing him. Okay, so the things that lie outside of technical control that fall under fortune are the things that we refer to God. For instance,
I would be curious to know, just as sort of an aside, how the interplay between technical skill and sort of luck, because those things do shade into each other, right? Like, seems like the harder you apply a technical, the more skillfully you apply a technical skill, the less luck sort of has to do with the situation, and maybe also the more possible domains you open up into luck. This kind of also seems like a bit of a God of the Gaps argument, or maybe a Fortune of the Gaps argument, where the role for fortune is constantly shrinking, but that's kind of beside the point. I guess we'll keep moving.
And awe, this sense of overpowering majesty, that we defer to the great authority and presence and glory of something greater than ourselves, a sense of awe before the Almighty, the awesomeness of the Almighty. So fortune, awe, and law produced there, spirit, law, and greed. You can wonder why Deci LM semantic space coded the word greed as part of the vector combination that gets us closest to God. Why do you think that is? What's the relationship between God and greed? And does that actually help us to clarify the concept of God, or does that introduce new sets of questions? By the way,
I mean, why porque no los dos, right? Like, why would you assume that, like, getting closer to the nature of something abstract would not raise new questions? I think that's to be expected. But I think something interesting here is that it is defying our expectations of what we would assume, like in the same way that people, when they find out that, you know, a lot of their tax dollars are being spent negligently and greedily, they have this awe before the state that gets this kind of childlike awe that gets shattered, and when they realize that there are sort of darker elements at play in the realm of the numinous and the awesome. So,
needless to say, that each of these concepts in turn, fortune, awe, law, spirit, and greed, is potentially its own abstract concept that isn't necessarily tangible. Is awe more tangible than God for you? Maybe in a sense. Is fortune? Yeah, I guess if you have good luck, bad luck, if things are going your way or not going your way, it's hard to call that tangible, so to speak, but it's relatable. Maybe it has more self-evidence behind it, that we know what we're talking about when we talk about fortune. We know what we're talking about when we talk about law. Although it's not so straightforward, because Plato has a dialogue called the Minos on the topic, what is law? And Plato's great book, which I've been mentioning in all my videos lately, The Laws. I'm doing a course on it at Millerman School. It also gets you into the question about law. What is law? What does law aim at? And all of that. So don't think that these concepts, never mind spirit and greed, are all self-evidently clear. But at any rate, okay, this research says that we can clarify the God vector using, in its semantic space, using these three-word combinations. Why this matters for AI research, SCC reveals how AI models conceptualize the world. The biases imparted into these models through corpus selection and fine-tuning are reflected in the semantic space of these models, right? They're not equivalent. They didn't give us the same answer. They gave us different answers with the overlap on law, which, as I say, is conspicuous and interesting and promising for those of you who are interested in political theology and the relationship of God to law, God's law, divine law, crucially important themes. The DESI LM and the Llama 3 models converge in their attribution of law to the concept of God, though the DESI model tilts the concept in a negative direction with the attribution of greed, which we noted and kind of leave as a question mark why that should be.
Also, why are you defining greed as a negative direction? Like, that seems like you already made your decision before you took the data instead of letting the data inform your decision. So I think, at risk of sounding like a feminist, you're going to have to check your bias in this space.
By elucidating how AI models see the world, now, of course, they don't really see the world, right? They've just been tasked with a very technical operation here of combining vectors to approximate a space in the a location in the semantic space. But let's call that, quote unquote, seeing the world. By elucidating how AI models see the world, SCC can provide critical insight into the inherent biases and blind spots of these models, and thereby contribute significantly to the ongoing conversation about AI ethics. That's not clear either. How would you know whether it's a bias or a blind spot if you're using vector analysis to clarify the concept of God? Because if you see that something's missing, that means you already have an existing concept of God, and then you're really asking, can we make our large language models approximate what we, give us the answer that we want? We're not going to learn anything new about God. We're just going to fine tune them until they spit out exactly what we believe belongs to the concept of God. That's what it would mean to find something missing.
Right. So the question is, are you letting the data speak for itself, or are you tailoring the data to fit your sort of preconceived notion of what divinity is? So it's funny because as Jordan Peterson often talks about, like, data interpretation being a religiously ethical thing, this is where those two things meet, because in order for him to accurately interpret the data, he's going to have to put down his religious presuppositions and let the data speak for itself. Otherwise, the data is just going to spit out exactly what he believes. So this is an interesting sort of double flip there, where he says, oh, well, data analysis is an ethical and spiritual enterprise, and then in this case, in order to get to the truth, he's going to have to throw off that sort of spiritual or ethical enterprise that's defined by spirituality, because right now he's trying to, define spirituality through data. So how do these biases affect his interpretation? How do these spiritual biases affect his interpretation of the data? It's a very curious concept. I'm not sure what the answer to it is.
In a way. Or a bias. Are we going to say that these quote unquote definitions or conceptual clarifications, vector-based expositions of the meaning of God, are biased towards the notion of a divine law? In what sense could you treat this sort of analysis? Maybe bias has a very specific meaning in the context of this LLM research, in which case you should comment and let me know how you think that works. But okay, Does it give us critical insight into the inherent biases and blind spots of these models and contribute significantly to the ongoing conversation about AI ethics? I mean, maybe the idea is that, like, okay, I'm going to give you a vulgar example. You plug in woman and it spits out kitchen, children, and homemaker. And you say, hey, wait a minute, that sounds sexist. We're going to fine tune our AI to be feminist. And it's now going to say, you know, businesswoman, doctor, astronaut.
Oh, I thought that meant fine tuning it to be a liar.
Or, you know, then that means you discovered a bias or you discovered something missing. If you put in who knows what, you know, you come up with your own examples, okay, of what that might look like. Is that what they mean here about contributing significantly to the ongoing conversation about AI ethics? You can't want to clarify the concept of God using a large language model. In other words, hope that the large language model teaches you something you didn't know, elucidates something that you didn't see, shows you the constituent sub-concepts of a concept that for you was originally and initially unclear and vague. You can't use it to do all of that, can you? And at the same time say, no, the result that it gives me is biased. It's not what I want. It needs to be tweaked. Because what if this gave us something completely unexpected? I wouldn't say that fortune, awe, and law is unexpected. I wouldn't say that spirit and law is unexpected. I would say greed is kind of unexpected. So let's take that. We have greed in the DCLM semantic space, together with spirit and law, getting us close to the God vector. So what do we do about this? Do we say, there's some notion in the concept of God concerning greed that we need to think through, because we didn't sort of expect to find it there, but now that we do find it, we need to think about it? Or do we say, oh, you know what, let's fine tune the system so that we get spirit, law, and love, spirit, law, and justice, spirit, law, and resurrection, spirit, law, and hope. Okay, understanding ourselves is the next section. Insofar as there is agreement between LLMs or unbiased models are used in SCC, meaning again semantic core clarification, the resulting semantic map can provide insight into our collective consciousness. This is because LLMs encode the semantic maps that are contained in our minds. Okay,
So to me, this seems like an over democratization of the process. So for the question is, what subset of the collective consciousness are these things mapping, right? So I would agree that the semantic maps that are contained in our minds are somewhat clarified by our language use and the correlations of words to other words, but what about a bunch of things that aren't semantic, like our motions, our actions, our emotions, our relationships? How are these things going to be encoded? Do we risk the problem of overly verbalizing everything, overly making everything a verbal argument? Because people probably are only like 5% verbal argument. At the end of it, we're mostly action. There's so many more actions that we do than words that we think. And this gets probably accentuated when you get into the probably lower 9, 10. Like the lower you go in IQ, the more people express themselves through action and the less they express themselves through words. But even the most intelligent people almost only express themselves through actions. So the words are just sort of a thin film on top that may or may not correspond to what's actually going on underneath the surface. So there's that, and also what sample of the collective consciousness are you looking at? Are you looking at everyone on Earth? Are you looking at, like, I don't know, devout Hindus? Are you looking at a monastery? Are you looking at a Catholic nunnery? Like, what are you looking at exactly? Are you looking at a college campus? What portion of the collective consciousness are you looking at? And I would like to see a way to measure that and to correct for errors, or at least changes, even if they're not errors, in these models. So again, just some definitions of terms when they're talking about unbiased models, when they're talking about collective consciousness. Like, I kind of need more meat on those bones there. Like, it sounds good, but when you realize that an unbiased model is probably, like, when you don't define what that is, it you could easily throw in some unintended consequences. So
I tell you, as a non-expert in this field, that this sounds like hugely overpromising and under-delivering, although a topic that is interesting enough to want to sort of specify how it overpromises and underdelivers and what its full potential might be. But let's see, the DESI-LM and Llama 3 models converge in their attribution of law to the concept of God. This suggests that a normative element is central to the concept of God, independent of the corpus and fine-tuning. Is that what it suggests? A normative element is central to the concept of God. Well, not just normative. There's more to being law than being normative, even though law is normative. So, for example, the concept of law itself would have to be disambiguated as to what's more important: political power, the political power of the lawmakers, or the law's normativity. You see?
also the spirit of the law or the letter of the law. I'm not sure by normative if they mean normative in the ethical sense or if they mean normative in that there's a common element central to this concept. So I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that. They could be using normative in either of those senses, in the more common way or the more formally ethical way. That would definitely require clarification. I think he's taking it as the more ethical in the more ethical sense of the word normative, and he's absolutely right in that law, the word law in and of itself is not necessarily normative. And again, this falls apart under a postmodern critique. And you could say, well, everything falls apart under postmodern critique. It's like, yeah, maybe, but the whole point of analyzing these semantic maps is that they're rigorous enough to withstand the sort of mudslide of postmodernism picking everything apart. So, like, if your LLM semantic core clarification or whatever just gets you back to modernism, all you're doing is going to get picked apart by sort of, these sort of midwit criticisms that are nonetheless very effective at sort of being a universal social acid. So, I would like to see. I think this has the potential to withstand all that criticism, but they're going to have to dig into their own unexamined first principles, and also elucidate the math that they're using and show exactly how this math produces the linguistic results that they're seeking.
This suggests, again, that a normative element is central to the concept of God, independent of the corpus and fine-tuning. By rank ordering the concept combinations in both semantic spaces, we find 3 terms to closely approximate the meaning of God in both spaces. So this is by doing a rank ordering the concept combinations. They find law, will, and wealth. This suggests that at its core, our collective conception of God is derived from our intuitions of normativity, volition, and abundance. So let's say it's true that wealth means abundance and will means volition. Does law mean normativity, or does law mean authority? Anyway, kind of interesting. Let's see. That's it on this short presentation. Again, Jordan Peterson was pretty excited by this when he posted about it, which I'll show you again in a minute. All kinds of questions. In and of itself, this is an interesting little experiment, but it leaves open a lot of questions, as you see. Also, the fact that in this training data, certain notions coalesce, or certain combinations produce a vector that's close to another vector, that is not equivalent to saying that that is the right definition of God. It clarifies what in the training data of the LLM, according to its inputs, which again was 3-word combination of 1,000 common abstract nouns. So given a certain training, given a certain input, given a certain training data, then you get an output that approximates this combination of vectors to the God vector or the given vector. But to repeat, maybe it was trained on the data of 999 imbeciles and 1 genius, and the genius's true definition of God is never going to come through this sort of calculative or combinatorial or vector mathematical approach.
What if the imbecile is correct and the genius is wrong and just has a better argument? That's also a possibility. See, the thing is, I think in order for this to withstand criticism, you have to be resilient enough to handle the criticism of postmodernism, and you also have to be you have to avoid the problem of falling into the notion that popularity or democracy can arrive at the right conclusion 100% of the time. So if you're asking a bunch of people, like he said, what three-word combination gets you closer to this abstract transcendent concept, and you ask them to all write down their 3 words on a little piece of paper, then how do you know which one is right? What is your objective measurement for determining the truth? It's definitely not popularity, and it wouldn't also be to average all of their answers together. Or if that was how you were deriving your answer, you would have to show mathematically and precisely why that is important, or why that is the way you're getting to your truth. So I definitely think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I'm going to cut this off because the rest is just, postscript and deposition. But I basically wanted to offer my critique of this topic because I think it's an important topic, but I think it definitely needs to be pressure tested by people capable of pressure testing it. One of the biggest concerns I have right now is that the sort of decay of Enlightenment values and they're falling apart under postmodernism is leading us back to, or having a lot of people try to reboot a sort of unthinking, sort of fascistic fundamentalism that I think has many of its own problems. One of the first and foremost being that it will just lead us back to the same situation that we are now, because that's basically what we were doing 400 years ago. And I don't see exactly how that transition, which is going to happen gracefully and in a way that answers the problems of the past, as opposed to just condemning us to repeat them. And I think binding language to mathematics is one of the things that actually will enable us to solve these problems, but we need to do that in an intelligent way that doesn't fall apart under the twin criticisms of populism and postmodernism. So that is basically my take on this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and until next time.